Have you ever had a conversation that, despite being brief, stayed with you for years? The kind of talk that unexpectedly changes the way you see the world or yourself. Well, I had one of those talks with my best friend's boyfriend. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't something either of us expected. But the raw honesty and connection we shared that night have stayed with me ever since. And the best part, it's a story about respect, understanding, and finding comfort in someone you least expected. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or your own story in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, before I begin, tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know which cities and towns are joining me for this memory that has stayed with me for years. You know how sometimes you walk into a room and it feels like something's just off? Like there's a quiet tension in the air that you can't put your finger on? That's exactly how I felt the first time I stepped into Mark's apartment. I'd known Mark for a while. He was my best friend's boyfriend, but up until that point, I hadn't spent much time alone with him. It was always the three of us, going out to dinner or catching a movie. Casual stuff, nothing too personal. But on that evening, it was just Mark and me. Sarah, my best friend, had canceled our plans at the last minute, and I didn't want to go home to an empty house. I called Mark, half-jokingly suggesting that I come over to hang out. To my surprise, he didn't hesitate. "Come on over," he said. "I'll put the kettle on." When I arrived, he was sitting on the couch with a half-empty bottle of wine beside him. He had this look in his eyes. Something was definitely on his mind. We greeted each other casually, as we always did. But there was a quiet weight in the room that I couldn't ignore. We made small talk at first, about work, about Sarah, but it felt like we were both skirting around something deeper. It was only after the first glass of wine that Mark finally spoke up. "You know, I've been meaning to talk to you about something," he said, his voice steady but a little hesitant. "It's about Sarah, and about me." My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea where this was going. We hadn't really discussed the details of their relationship before. Sarah had always kept that part of her life private. But Mark wasn't the kind of guy to get emotional or serious easily. He was the type to crack jokes and keep things light. So when he said this, I knew it was important. "I've been feeling," he trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if it's just me, but lately I've been feeling like I'm losing touch with her. It's like we're not on the same wavelength anymore. And it's not like I don't care. I do. But something feels missing." I nodded slowly, not sure what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him that it was just a phase, that relationships go through ups and downs, and that Sarah would probably snap out of it. But another part of me, the part that had always been a good listener, just wanted to let him talk. "I don't know," Mark continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "It's like we're both drifting, but we don't know how to get back to where we were. I don't know how to fix it." There was a pause, and the silence between us felt heavy. I looked at Mark, really looked at him. I'd always known he cared about Sarah, but this was something different. This wasn't just about being in a relationship. This was about a man feeling lost, unsure, and searching for answers. I wasn't sure why he'd chosen me to talk to of all people. I mean, we weren't exactly close, at least not in the way Sarah and I were. But I guess, sometimes, when we're at our lowest, we end up reaching out to the most unlikely person for help. "Mark," I said softly, breaking the silence. "You're not alone in this. We all go through moments when we feel disconnected. It doesn't mean it's the end." He gave me a look that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't a smile, but it was something close. Appreciation, maybe, or relief. For a moment, he looked younger, like the weight of the world had been taken off his shoulders. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said, almost to himself. "I've tried talking to her, but it feels like we're just not hearing each other. And I hate that. I don't want to lose her." I didn't know what to say. How do you comfort someone who's caught in the middle of something so painful? But I had to try. I shifted in my seat, thinking about how to frame my words. Maybe it's not about fixing things, I said slowly. Maybe it's about understanding each other better. Sometimes we forget that listening is just as important as talking. Mark looked at me then, and for a moment, I could see the vulnerability in his eyes. He was a grown man, someone who, by all outward appearances, had his life together. But in that moment, I saw a side of him that was raw, unsure, and needing guidance. I just want to get it right, he said, his voice quieter now. I don't want to be the one who messes everything up. I didn't know what to say to that, but I reached across the table, placing a hand on his. It was a small gesture, but it felt like the right thing to do. I think you're doing okay, I said. Sometimes it's just about being patient with yourself and with her. You'll find your way. We sat there for a while, not saying much, just letting the quiet settle between us. The kettle clicked off, and Mark stood up to refill our glasses. I watched him, feeling an unexpected warmth in my chest. I hadn't expected this conversation to go the way it had, but I was glad it had. I didn't know it then, but that night would stay with me for years. That conversation, brief and unassuming as it was, would become a turning point for me, both in how I saw Mark and in how I saw relationships in general. And as I left his apartment later that night, I felt strangely comforted, not by anything he had said directly, but by the simple act of sharing something vulnerable. Maybe that's what we all need in life, someone who will just listen, without judgment, and offer a little comfort when we least expect it. The next few weeks passed in a blur, but I couldn't shake the memory of that conversation with Mark. Something about it lingered with me, as though the words we shared had opened a door I hadn't even known was there. I had always seen Mark as Sarah's boyfriend, someone who fit neatly into the background of our friendship, like a fixture that was always present, but never really a part of the deeper emotional layers of our lives. But after that night, it was different. It wasn't like I was suddenly hanging out with him more or calling him up to check in, but whenever I saw him, it felt like there was an unspoken connection between us. We never really talked about that conversation again, at least not directly. It was as though it had created a silent understanding between us, a quiet acknowledgement that we'd both shared something important. And that's when it started to get tricky. It wasn't that anything overt happened. There were no grand gestures, no attempts at anything more than friendship. But there was a shift, a subtle one, but enough for me to notice. For instance, I found myself thinking about him more often than I thought I should. I'd catch myself wondering how he was doing, what he was thinking, even though I wasn't a part of his inner circle. And sometimes, when I'd see him with Sarah, there was a kind of tension in the air. It was like I could sense the distance between them before either of them even said a word. It wasn't that Sarah and I ever talked about Mark's issues. She wasn't the type to share much about her relationship with me. She kept things close to the chest. And I respected that. But I could see it in the way she talked to him, the way they held space for each other when they were together. It was as though they were two people living side by side, but not really together. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner where I could tell something was off between them, Sarah pulled me aside. She'd had a glass or two of wine, and her usual composure was a little looser than usual. "You know," she began, looking at me with a sort of tired vulnerability, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said to Mark that night." I froze, caught off guard by the sudden shift in conversation. I hadn't expected her to bring it up, not like this. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, as though I didn't feel a slight pang of guilt for what had transpired between Mark and me. She sighed, her eyes searching mine for something. An answer, maybe, or just someone who understood. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think we've been in a rut, both of us, but I don't know how to get out of it. He's been distant, and I don't know waiting for things to get better. But it's like we're stuck in this cycle, and I don't know how to fix it. He won't talk to me about it, and I don't know what else to do. I felt a pang of sympathy for her, even though I knew I couldn't give her the answers she was hoping for. Sarah and I had been friends for so long, and I hated seeing her in pain, especially when I could tell how much she loved Mark. But at the same time, I couldn't help but feel that maybe Mark's frustration wasn't entirely her fault. I had seen it in his eyes, the same uncertainty and confusion that had crept into his voice when we had talked. It wasn't about her. It was about him too. "Have you tried just talking to him?" I asked gently. "Really talking, like, without all the distractions?" She shook her head, laughing bitterly. "It's not that easy, you know that. It never is." I didn't press her further. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging between us. "Thanks for listening," she said finally, her voice quiet. "I don't even know what I'm asking for, but I just don't want to lose him." It was then that I realized how much she was struggling, how much she was holding inside. Sarah was strong, always had been, but sometimes even the strongest people need someone to lean on. And in that moment, I wasn't sure whether she needed me to be a friend or a confidant, or something else entirely. After that conversation, things between Mark and me stayed quiet for a while. There were no late-night heart-to-hearts, no more moments of vulnerability shared in private. I think we both understood that the door we had opened needed to remain closed. I respected that boundary. But one evening, a few weeks later, I found myself back at his apartment. This time, Sarah wasn't with me. She was at a work event. And when I arrived, Mark was alone. He was standing in front of the window, looking out at the city, his hands resting on the windowsill like he was deep in thought. I knocked lightly on the doorframe to get his attention, and he turned around, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey, you're here," he said, his voice lighter than usual. "Come in, I was just thinking." I raised an eyebrow. "About what?" He shrugged and gestured for me to sit. "Life, I guess. Or maybe just where it's all going. You know how it is." I sat down, suddenly aware of the strange quiet between us. There was something different in his demeanor, something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't sadness or anxiety this time. It was something more settled, like he was beginning to accept whatever it was that had been weighing on him. "You know," he said after a moment, "I've been talking to Sarah more. Really talking. I think I understand her better now." I nodded, trying not to let the relief that washed over me show too clearly. Mark wasn't the type to open up easily, so to hear him say that meant something. It was as if he was finally starting to find his way through the fog, and I was glad for him. "That's good," I said. "Really good." He smiled again, this time more genuinely. "Yeah, I think it is. Maybe I've been too wrapped up in my own head. Sometimes it takes stepping back to see what's right in front of you." We sat there in the quiet for a few moments, and I could feel the weight of the past few weeks lifting off of both of us. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it was a shift, one that felt like a turning point, not just for Mark and Sarah, but for me too. Sometimes it's the conversations you least expect that end up being the most important, and maybe that was the point. Maybe we all needed to learn how to talk to each other more, how to listen, and how to offer the space for vulnerability without judgment. Mark had taught me that, and in some strange, unspoken way, I think I had taught him too. It wasn't long after that evening with Mark that Sarah and I found ourselves having one of those rare heart-to-heart conversations that, when they do happen, always leave you feeling a bit vulnerable, but also strangely lighter. I had been feeling this knot in my chest for weeks now, knowing that something had shifted between her and me, between us and everything else in our lives. We had always been close, but I couldn't deny the subtle distance that had crept in over time. I couldn't pinpoint when it started, but I had felt it growing quietly in the background, like a song that was always playing but just out of earshot. That day we were sitting on her couch, sipping coffee and watching the rain come down in sheets outside her window. The soft pitter-patter of the droplets against the glass was comforting, almost like nature was giving us space to breathe. Sarah's usual energy, the one that was always so full of life and animation, seemed absent. She sat there with her mug in hand, her eyes fixed on the rain, but there was a faraway look in them. "Do you ever feel like you're losing control?" she asked out of nowhere, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. I blinked, caught off guard. Losing control of what? Of everything. Of your life, of the things that matter. She paused, a slight frown tugging at her lips. I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about Mark lately, and I don't know what's happening anymore. It feels like we're two people living in the same house, but we're not really living together. Does that make sense? I sat up a little straighter, the weight of her words settling into my chest. I had been trying to avoid talking about Mark and her relationship, not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure how to navigate it without making things worse. But here it was, all of it, spilling out in front of me. She was reaching for something, anything, and I wasn't sure if I was the right person to give it to her. "You've mentioned that before," I said gently, setting my mug down. "But have you really talked to him? I mean, really talked to him? Not just about the day-to-day stuff, but about how you both are feeling." She shook her head, her hand running through her hair in frustration. "I've tried, but it's like we're talking in circles. He tells me things are fine, but I know they're not. And then I feel guilty for even asking. Maybe I'm the problem." I felt a familiar ache in my chest. This was a feeling I knew too well. The feeling of being stuck, of wanting to move forward, but not knowing how. I had been there before, in relationships, in my own life, and I could see that Sarah was caught in a cycle of self-doubt that I couldn't break for her. "You're not the problem," I said softly. "Relationships are complicated, and sometimes even the strongest connections go through phases where everything feels off. But that doesn't mean it's over. You both just need to be honest with each other." "I don't know if I can handle any more honesty," she said, her voice breaking a little. "I've already put so much of myself into this relationship, and I'm scared that if I push too hard, I'll just push him away completely. I can't lose him." I could see the tears in her eyes, even if she was trying to hide them. It was strange, sitting there with Sarah, watching her struggle in a way I had never seen before. She had always been the strong one, the one with all the answers. But now she was just as uncertain as anyone. And in that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if perhaps this whole thing was bigger than just Mark or her. It was about them, about two people trying to make sense of something neither of them fully understood. I wanted to say the right thing, to give her the answer she was looking for, but the truth was that I didn't have one. Sometimes there are no neat solutions, no easy fixes. All I could do was listen and be there for her, just as I had been for Mark. "I don't have the answers," I admitted, my voice soft. "But I know you can figure this out. I believe in you, Sarah. You've always been so strong. And Mark, he's not perfect. None of us are. But if you really want this to work, you both need to be vulnerable with each other. Really vulnerable. And I think you need to be honest with yourself, too." She looked at me then, and for the first time in what felt like ages, she smiled, a small, tired smile, but a smile all the same. "I think I'm just afraid of what happens if we do get honest. What if it changes everything? What if it's not what we thought it would be?" "That's always the risk," I said, my heart aching for her. "But you won't know unless you try. And no matter what happens, you don't have to go through it alone." We sat there in silence for a while, the rain continuing its gentle assault on the windows. I could see the conflict in Sarah's eyes, the same internal battle I had fought countless times, the fight between comfort and change, between staying where it's safe and taking the leap into the unknown. That night, I found myself thinking about vulnerability again. I kept coming back to Mark, to that night we had talked, to the rawness of that conversation. The vulnerability we had shared was, in many ways, a turning point, not just for him, but for me too. I had learned something about myself in that moment, something I hadn't fully understood before, that sometimes all we need is someone who's willing to listen. And sometimes the act of listening, of holding space for someone else's truth, can make all the difference. It was then that I realized, maybe this was why that conversation with Mark had stayed with me for so long. Maybe it wasn't just about Mark and Sarah. It was about how we all need people in our lives who can help us see the truth of what's happening, even when it's messy, even when it's uncomfortable. And maybe that's what true friendship is, not always having the answers, but being there for each other, no matter where the conversation leads. The next time I saw Mark, it was a week later. It was casual at first, the way things always were, just small talk, no deeper conversations. But as the night wore on, I could feel the familiar pull of that connection we had shared before. And I realized then, in a quiet way, that I had come to appreciate him more than I ever had. Not because of anything he had done for me, but because of the honesty he had shown me in that moment of vulnerability. It had been simple, but it had been real. It had been real enough to stay with me, to echo through my days long after that conversation had ended. And I knew, in that moment, that Mark wasn't the only one who had changed. We both had. I never quite realized how much I had been holding back until it all started to settle in, until I saw it all unfold before me. In the weeks that followed my conversation with Sarah, I started noticing something I hadn't before. It wasn't just about Mark and Sarah anymore. It wasn't even about the quiet spaces that had opened between them. It was about me, my own emotional growth, the ways I had been moving through the world, and how those small moments of connection, the ones that had seemed insignificant at the time, had shaped who I was becoming. It had all started with that night at Mark's apartment, that evening when we had sat together, simply talking about things we hadn't expected to talk about. It had been an unexpected conversation, but in some ways, it had set something in motion. And now, even as I watched Sarah and Mark try to find their way back to each other, I could feel a new sense of clarity stirring inside me. Things were shifting between Sarah and Mark, slowly but surely. I could tell because every time I saw them together, I noticed the small, subtle changes in the way they interacted. The way Mark would look at her a little longer than usual, as if he were savoring her presence. Or the way Sarah would lean into him when they sat together, her hand resting on his, as if she was testing the waters of trust again. They were beginning to find their way back to each other, piece by piece, day by day. And although I wasn't there to witness every moment, I could feel it in the air, this quiet sense of healing that was taking place between them. But it wasn't just them. I realized, as time passed, that I was healing too. It wasn't anything obvious. It wasn't like some grand epiphany. But there was something quieter, deeper, unfolding within me. I had been stuck for so long, unsure of what I wanted or where I was headed. And yet, over the past few months, I had found a way to let go of some of that uncertainty. Maybe it had come from the conversations I'd had with Mark, the ones that had left me feeling more in touch with myself. Maybe it had come from my growing understanding of the power of listening, of really hearing someone, not just with your ears, but with your heart. That's the thing about vulnerability, I realized. It's not just something you give to others. It's something you give to yourself too. That night with Mark had been a turning point for both of us, but it wasn't just about his self-discovery. It was about mine too. I had always been so careful with my emotions, so protective of the parts of myself that I thought were fragile. But now, I could see how important it was to let others in, to share what I was feeling, even when it was uncomfortable. To trust that, even in moments of uncertainty, there was always room for growth. One evening, a couple of months later, I met Mark for dinner at a little bistro in the neighborhood. It was just the two of us, which was unusual, but somehow it felt right. Sarah had been busy with work, and I hadn't seen much of Mark outside of the occasional group hangouts. But that night we had some time, and I think we both knew that there was still something unspoken between us, something that needed to be acknowledged before it could fade away into the past. "Hey," Mark began, stirring his wine slowly, his eyes focused on the glass but not really seeing it. "I just wanted to say thanks for the talk we had that night. I've thought about it a lot, and honestly, it's helped me figure some things out." I smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. "I'm glad it helped. But you're the one who did the work, Mark. It was you who decided to open up." He looked at me, then really looked at me. "I know, but I needed someone to hear me, to make me realize that it wasn't just about fixing things, it was about understanding them. You made me see that, and it's been a huge shift in more ways than one." There was a weight in his voice that I hadn't noticed before, this quiet sense of gratitude, or maybe something even deeper, something that had taken root over the months since our conversation. It was like he had reached a place where he no longer felt the need to have all the answers, but instead was willing to sit with the uncertainty and let it be. "I think you're doing just fine," I said quietly, "and I think Sarah sees it too." Mark nodded slowly, taking a sip of his wine. "I hope so. We're still figuring things out, but I'm starting to believe it's possible." We sat there for a while in the comfortable silence that had come to define our conversations. There was no rush, no pressure to fix anything. Just the understanding that sometimes things take time. That's something I had learned over the past few months. Healing, growth, understanding, they don't happen overnight. They take patience and sometimes a little bit of help from the people around you. As the night drew to a close, we walked out of the restaurant together. The streets were quiet, and the air was crisp with the promise of fall. The city around us buzzed with life, but for a moment it felt like time had slowed down. We were two people who had shared something unexpected, something that had changed both of us in ways we couldn't quite articulate, but that didn't make it any less real. "I think I owe you one," Mark said as we reached the corner, his voice light now, almost teasing. I laughed, shaking my head. "No owing. We just needed to be honest with each other. That's all." He smiled, the kind of smile that comes from understanding, from mutual respect. "Yeah, you're right, but still, thanks." "Anytime," I said, the words feeling warm, sincere. As we said our goodbyes and I walked home, I thought about everything that had happened in the last few months. The conversations with Mark, the moments with Sarah, the quiet ways we had all been finding our way through the messiness of life. I thought about how strange it was that, in the end, it wasn't the big moments that had shaped us. It wasn't the grand gestures or the dramatic confrontations. It was the quiet, unspoken things, the moments of connection, the shared silences, the raw honesty that had brought us all closer together. And I realized as I walked down the familiar streets that I wasn't afraid of change anymore, because sometimes the most unexpected connections are the ones that leave the biggest impact.